Where does thought leadership fit within the worlds of technology and entrepreneurship? Today, to investigate that question, I sit down with Dr. Chitra Anand. Over her career, she's been a head of communications for tech giants like Microsoft and also an advisor to startups. She specializes in the role of the intrapreneur, a role which aligns closely with thought leadership. I'm Bill Sherman, and this is Leveraging Thought Leadership. Ready? Let's begin. So, welcome to the show, Chitra.
Thank you for having me. I'm so excited to be here.
So, this is a conversation where we're going to talk about thought leadership from several different perspectives. We're going to talk about it from intrapreneurship, which I know is a topic that you're deeply passionate about. We'll talk about marketing. And also, I want to explore also one of the projects you're working on, which is private equity. So let's start with a simple question. How do you define thought leadership?
Yeah, it's a great question, Bill. And from my perspective, thought leadership, I believe, is the greatest form of competitive differentiation right now for marketers. I would define it as deliberate content that really takes a outside-in perspective on social issues, cultural issues that really ties and leverages the talents and experiences and passions within your business.
With that, you come from a marketing background, right?
I do.
So tell us a little bit about your background and how your road led to thought leadership.
Well, it's interesting because I've been in the technology industry for 25 years, and I believe that thought leadership it's been coined as a term. And in the past, companies may or may not have been doing it without actually realizing it. So, for example, I had a great career at TELUS. I spent over 10 years at TELUS, which is sort of the equivalent of a Verizon in the US. And I was there right when, the social spectrum sort of blew up and we were looking at all these new social platforms, media platforms. But we very intuitively knew that people needed engaging content and we wanted to be a form of education to our customers, to our partners. And so we created namesake content, whether it was editorial content, whether it was workshops, talks, and we really educated our customers around the new trends and technologies that were really transformative during that time. Similarly, when I then went over to Microsoft, thought leadership was starting to become a thing. But, one of the things that I did there was ensured that we had this ongoing cadence of content. And it was a very deliberate move to really have this always on cadence on what was happening in the market. So an editorial piece that was tied to something that was happening, based on a calendar year, what was happening from a business perspective in the markets. We created a little bit of a TEDx series where we had some thought leaders come together talking about certain issues, opportunities as it relates to entrepreneurship within Canada. And we did that, in a very deliberate way. So when I was in both of those roles, the thought leadership piece was always this byproduct of the work that I did as a marketer there.
So let's dive in a little bit further on that. So this intersection between thought leadership, marketing, building relationships, you've talked about content. And I think when a lot of marketers talk about content, it leads to content marketing. Distinguish for me, if you will, what's the difference between content marketing in your perspective and how it's used versus thought leadership?
That's a great point. I think thought leadership is more insight, is led by research and insight. When we think about content marketing, some of my observations in the market has been leveraging your product or services within that form of marketing. So there's a tie to your product or service. Thought leadership is outside of that realm where it's really deeply rooted in insight and research. So for example, one of the pieces that I've written when I was at Microsoft was really around, what are the macro trends that are happening in Canada around the small medium business space and not related to Microsoft, but what are the technologies that are driving entrepreneurial companies in our country, and why are eyes on Canada as the new Silicon Valley? So that was more of an insight driven piece of work. Whereas in the past, trying to get away from content marketing, some of the pieces of content marketing was, how can a product or service, whether it's at TELUS or Microsoft, really help drive an issue forward or solve a problem, etc. So where you have more of a product-centric view of the firm in the piece of marketing, thought leadership is more around a topic that is namesake or a macro trend that's happening in the market, where there's a particular insight.
And I think this distinction is one. Content marketing is very much tied to the sales pipeline.
Yeah.
And to identifying who's a prospective buyer and how do you get them through, marketing qualified lead, sales qualified lead to close deal. Whereas with thought leadership, you may have a sale or an offer in mind, but it's a much different relationship and a much different time horizon. And I like the distinction that you make there. Now let's talk about time horizon from a different perspective, because you've taken a role for thought leadership tied to private equity. And when I first saw your bio, I was surprised by that, because I said, okay, private equity and thought leadership, how are these two going together? So let's start there.
Well, that's interesting. Yes. So I was part of a firm called Mavericks, where I was leading their branding, marketing, and thought leadership. And I mean, your point is really quite interesting, because you don't see a lot of private equity firms investing in a CMO or that type of role. But here's my observation. When you're meeting with portfolio companies, and so aside from the firm itself, the greatest opportunity that I see these growth companies have is really around how are they packaging their companies. And so what I mean by that, it's more than just brand positioning, but what they can offer is an opportunity to really tell an integrated narrative. And I think there's a lot of opportunity there. But from a firm perspective, I think what these firms are after is, as much as they are there to, return shareholder value and create success for their investors, they are starting to think about, well, how can we be leaders and how can we differentiate ourselves in a more meaningful way through insights and research around particular topics? And those topics can be tied to various industries, various verticals, etc. So I think there's great opportunity there. One of the things I just observed, Bill, was Bessemer Ventures just hired a CMO, and that very role is really around cultivating thought leadership. And so, we talked about earlier how thought leadership or content marketing really drives the pipeline in terms of sales. But what I think that thought leadership really does is it creates trust. And when you have trust, that's when people want to do business with you. So you're competing with companies wanting to do business with you and customers. And so what happens is the rate of acquisition for customers increases through these deliberate efforts. And those were my biggest observations there.
And I think that acquisition piece is important in terms of trust and accelerating the rate. Let's think on this for a second here. In the world of private equity and identifying firms, which ones they're going to bring into the portfolio versus which ones they pass on the deal, where is there a space for looking at either the presence or absence of thought leadership during due diligence?
That's a great question. I think that's an important question. It really depends on the maturity and the thinking of the firm, right? And what I mean by that is most of these companies are in a growth trajectory. They want to grow, they want to scale, they want to accelerate, because that's how these companies are really truly successful. Now,
Well,
Most
and you're
people are
talking specifically tech private equity rather
correct.
than, yeah, which is a
Well,
subset.
I mean, that's interesting. I am, but it doesn't necessarily have to be because even if you have a consumer-based product, for example, you can still have a voice within the thought leadership spectrum and have some interesting content that's engaging because people always want to engage with meaningful content, regardless of what industry you're in or whatever it is that you're doing. It's really about engaging content. So yes, tech-based. However, I think just coming out of what's happening in the global pandemic and you're seeing all of these startups and you're seeing all these companies that are being born out of the pandemic, people want to engage with companies. And how do you engage with them?
Hmm.
You can engage with
Hmm.
them through content, with really meaningful content, and not content marketing, but these thought leadership pieces, because people want to be challenged, they want to learn, they want insights, they want things that are rooted in something. And that's what thought leadership provides. It's a deeper look at certain topics, at things that are happening in our world. And really, quite frankly, it draws a direct line into how the company operates. You know, what are the things that they care about? How are they governing their own business? And I think that it plays into a bit of the culture of the organization because I do believe that culture dictates business. And so it's a cultural fabric and a cultural component, and it really helps shape the way firms are thinking.
If you are enjoying this episode of Leveraging Thought Leadership, please make sure to subscribe. If you'd like to help spread the word about the podcast, please leave a 5-star review and share it with your friends. We are available on Apple Podcast, Spotify, and all major platforms, as well as at leveragingthoughtleadership.com. With that, you've talked about the ability to tell the story better. And I think from a PE perspective, when you're looking and saying, where is their value that's not captured? If you're a manufacturing firm, you can go, okay, do we bring in new manufacturing equipment, et cetera? Can we reach and address new markets? But for technology, how do you get a deeper penetration into the addressable market, right? For tech. And I think telling the story more effectively, whether it's from a marketing perspective or a thought leadership perspective, how do you engage in the marketplace of ideas for which the application or software or whatever tech component is the secondary solution? Does that resonate?
100%. I know exactly what you're saying. And so here's the thing. You have to take it up a notch and look at the macro view and say, what is the problem that we're solving? Or what is the grander issue that we're addressing? And then how do we do that through, the technology is just a byproduct of that. But every technology, you need to almost think of it as addressing something bigger and grander. And you have to take a few steps back, look at what's happening at a world view, at a world lens, and then think about how does that apply to your respective business and what is the problem that you're solving. And one of the biggest things that I say to, anytime I go do a keynote or anybody that I'm talking to, or even to any of these portfolio companies, what is the problem that you're solving? And then you work from there.
Well, and with that, I think there's an ability to fall in love with the technology for technology's sake.
Yes.
Or as you're in finishing getting the platform or the application together, you've been focusing so much on the technology and making it just work that you can lose sight of, okay, who's your customer? How are they using it? What do they need? And what problems are they not only facing today, but what are they going to face in 2 years? And how are you going to prepare them for that problem?
100%. Absolutely. I always have viewed technology as the enabler. Like if technology is the enabler, there's a bigger problem. And so if you think of it from that perspective, it creates a relatability factor to your market, right? If people can't relate to what it is that you're doing or understand what you're doing, then why would they care? So it's all about this, this relatability factor that I talk about a lot. And so it's not an easy task either. I mean, it takes time. It takes thinking. It takes research. And so, it's the thinking where people, struggle, because sometimes these companies are just stuck within their own companies and their own paradigm, and they're not quite sure what they're doing and why they're doing, and how is this, connected to a bigger problem. So they get stuck within their paradigm, and it's a difficult exercise, but I would say that it's a very, very meaningful exercise.
Let's turn to a topic that I know you're passionate about, entrepreneurship. And my question for you, let's start with what is entrepreneurship? Let's set the ground rules on that. And then from there, let's talk about the intersection.
Yes. So entrepreneurship is a concept that I've devoted my doctoral research to. And I became very enamored with the topic, Bill. Just for context, I spent my time in these big companies at OpenText and TELUS and Microsoft, and I was an entrepreneur operating inside these companies, and I didn't really realize it. And it was my
Mhm.
opportunity to give back and put some structure around what I believe is an opportunity for organizations to institutionalize this concept in order to thrive. So an entrepreneur is a person that takes an entrepreneurial approach from within a large, complex organization that drives innovative thinking, new business models, and new ways of conducting business. And that's the fundamental definition.
And this is where I think there's a fascinating connection. Let's explore it between thought leadership and entrepreneurship, because whether it's an entrepreneur or an intrapreneur, the ability to see around the corner and spot the opportunity and then figure out what you need to do today to take advantage of that opportunity, that applies to entrepreneurship, intrapreneurship, as well as thought leadership, because you've got to be 1 foot in the future, 1 foot in the present. Talk to me a little bit about what you see in the role of entrepreneur and how it intersects with thought leadership.
I love that question. When I think about thought leadership is just experimenting with ideas. You're experimenting with concepts. You are creating a cocktail or an intersection of, technology meets consumerism, meets culture, meets all these different points of intersection. And so, in order to produce a really interesting piece of work, you need to experiment with ideas. And if you're an entrepreneur, entrepreneurship is a platform of experimentation. It's, taking the opportunity and assuming some risk and being vulnerable and being creative on how these ideas are going to play out. And then that could potentially turn into something a little bit more tangible. So there's huge crossroads there, and there's huge intersections there. So whether it's a mindset or whether it's the willingness to experiment, I think there's a great intersection there.
So let's push a little further on experimentation with
Mm.
ideas. Do you
Mhm.
have a story or an example, either from your time working as entrepreneur, that you can share, or that you've seen with some of the portfolio companies that you've worked
Mhm.
with?
Mhm. I mean, it's a great question. I'll give you some examples at Microsoft, whether it was bringing the Surface to the Canadian market, for example. One of the things that Microsoft wanted to do was to transform their brand into a little bit more edgy and be the underdog. And so for me, my role was really to push the business out of their comfort zone. And so, it's, people that had tenure at the company, 10 years in their role, yet you want to bring in a new mindset of taking a more risk. What's the campaign or opportunity where we can launch a new product, but do it in a more edgy, risky way rather than do, a roundtable with media, for example. And so, for me, it was really trying to take the business out of their comfort zone to try new ways of thinking, engaging with new audiences, showing them that that technology is an enabler of the audiences that we want to engage with, whether they're creative class or entrepreneurs, whether they're single mothers or new mothers. These are all audiences. And how do we do that in a meaningful way where the Surface, let's say, can be a tool for these people in order to do something interesting?
So with entrepreneurship, there's a number of people who I think want to get started but don't know how. And I
Mm-hmm.
think that's also true inside of organizations
Mhm.
where you have subject matter experts and practitioners who
Mhm.
have a wealth of knowledge, but they don't know
Mhm.
how to get their idea out into the organization.
Mhm.
So, do you have advice in that entrepreneurial marketplace of ideas, how
Mhm.
the organization notices ideas, curates
Mhm.
ideas, and
Mhm.
elevates them?
It's a very, very interesting question, Bill. And I would say this: the one thing that we should always do as business people, and even as operating as entrepreneurs, is to question why we're doing what we're doing. And the reason why I say that is we are creatures of habit. Business is a creature of habit. And sometimes we're just going through the motions because we're afraid of risk, we're afraid of being a bit too provocative. But I think that the world right now that we live in requires that, to surface issues, through to talk about things that we may not be comfortable talking about, and doing new and interesting things. So I would say questioning why we're doing what we're doing, and that will rationalize your behavior, and maybe that will take you in a new paradigm. I think I have this chapter in my book where I talk about first principles thinking. And, so many times when I was at Microsoft or the Telesis of the world, and, we want to try a new idea or try something, and people would say, well, we've done that, we've tried that, it was too expensive. And so my whole issue is, we are operating on assumptions, and assumptions are preconceived ideas that may or may not be correct. And what we need to do as business people is sort of peel back the layers and go back to the raw data and facts on how do we do things a bit more cleverly. How do those data and facts will help us actually take more risk. And that's what I think is really interesting there.
Well, and I want to underline the concept of taking risk, but taking risk intelligently. Because I think thought leadership at its heart is focused on risks and opportunities and making sense of them ahead of time. Because it's so easy within a workspace to feel like you're always putting out fires or that you're always taking the safe choice. But we know that growth doesn't come from the routine safe choice. And so having that framework, like you said, going back to first principles and asking yourself, if we weren't a multi-billion dollar company, if we weren't a Microsoft of the world, how would we do this? How would we be scrappy? How would we get attention in the marketplace? And there are some times that I think that you have to change your perspective. And if you're small and you're a startup, ask yourself, what tools would a large organization bring to bear on this idea? And you may not have the same flexibility both ways. You can't, manufacture a marketing department overnight if you're a startup, but you can learn from some of the approaches. And the same from a large firm asking where is risk and opportunity.
I love it. Absolutely. I mean, and you said something really interesting, Bill, which was around calculated risk. I am a firm believer that no greatness comes with failure. And I believe that within chaos lies innovation, and the messier, the better. Like, I'm not afraid of messes.
Hmm.
And I think that we
Fail
need to,
fast.
absolutely. I mean, and I'm never afraid. I think what we need to do is, when we think about organizations, and I talk a lot about this in my book, is that we need to sort of reframe failure, reframe rules. We need to think about how they're flexible and malleable, and they're more guiding principles. And I'm not saying, take the house down, but you need to be able to push boundaries. You need to be able to, I will confidently say that, in my roles that I've been at, I've always pushed boundaries. And without pushing boundaries, you can't achieve greatness. And we have to accept that as business people, and we have to sort of reimagine how companies are operating, and we have to invite that. And that's a cultural framework. And so you need to think about a plan B or a plan C, and being able to, redivert or divert here or go there, because that's just the world that we live in. It's not going to be perfect. It's not linear. There will be issues, and we have to almost teach that skill within our talent pool on how do you redirect that? How do you live and thrive within chaos? Because that is the world that we live in now. So I think that's a skill, and we should embrace that, because that really does unleash the magic.
I think that's a great place for us to wrap up. Let me ask you this question. If people want to get in touch with you, how can they do so?
I would love for people to get in touch with me. I can be found on Twitter. I'm on LinkedIn. I'm on Instagram. Chitra Anand, Dr. Chitra Anand, and it's been such a pleasure. And thank you so much.
Thank you very much. If you're interested in organizational thought leadership, then I invite you to subscribe to the OrgTL newsletter. Each month, we talk about the people who create, curate, and deploy thought leadership on behalf of their organizations. Go to the website orgtl.com and choose Join Our Newsletter. I'll leave a link to the website as well as my LinkedIn profile in the show notes. Thanks for listening, and I look forward to hearing what you thought of the show.